Hello again, everyone. I was asked in a comment on one of my other videos about good representations of fairies in fiction and pop culture and media that I might recommend. So I thought the easiest way to respond to that would be to just do a short video sort of on the topic. As you can see, I am actually a pretty big connoisseur of fairies in media, I guess you could say, particularly urban fantasy. High fantasy is sort of a different, I like that as well, but it's sort of a different genre. And when we see fairies in high fantasy, what we're usually seeing is like Tolkien-esque elves. And that has its whole own problems and sort of conversation that could go along with that. But urban fantasy is sort of a different thing. And it particularly tends to interest me because urban fantasy is more where we often will see folkloric fairies, or at least an attempt at folkloric fairies, coming into play. Particularly because urban fantasy, the concept behind it is generally fairies within some attempt at our reality. Whether it's our modern world, whether it's a historic version of our world, but it's the idea of our Earth as we know it in some sense, but with fairies, by some definition, as real beings that are tangible and experienced usually by a much wider segment of the population than you would see in our current consensual reality. So a lot of urban fantasy sort of hinges on this idea that either they exist and are hidden except for a few humans are aware of them, or what's becoming increasingly popular is sort of the idea of they exist and all of human society is aware of them and they're sort of interacting with them in some sense. So clearly that is a topic that really interests me. For those of you that have followed my YouTube videos for a while, you'll know that I presented a paper at Ohio State University in February of 2019, which touched on the way that urban fantasy in particular is taking the old folkloric concept of the two fairy courts from Scotland, the Seelie and Unseelie courts, and adapting it and changing it, sometimes very radically. So clearly I read a lot of urban fantasy. That's the only way to kind of keep up with things that are going on in the genre, and with the way that modern popular culture is envisioning fairies and understanding them. Because what we often see is this idea, because particularly mainstream and popular culture are so disconnected from the actual folklore and the actual folk traditions, where they are getting their basis of belief from is popular culture and mass media. So these books then become resources from which people then build belief, which is in itself really super highly problematic. So, getting to the actual question, that's the point of this video, things that I recommend. Not a lot, to be honest. I would certainly recommend reading most of what I have on my bookshelf, which, I mean, I really can't list all of them, but I have basically 5 shelves worth of assorted urban fantasy collected, and then some pop characters up there. The reason, though, that I generally do not jump to recommending all of these is that the majority of pop culture depictions of fairies are not really depictions of folkloric fairies. The vast majority of them are actually so anthropomorphized. They're so turned into basically otherworldly humans or magical humans that they're profoundly disconnected from what we would see in folklore. And that is a big part of the current trend that is leading people to treat fairies or assume that fairies are actually really just a lot like human beings, but with some magic, which is not what we find in the folklore. There are, however, some that I do recommend. So what I wanted to do is sort of pull these to show you. This is the first one on the top of the pile. It's a book called The Call. There is a second book. I'm not sure if the author is going to turn it into a full series, if he's going for a trilogy. I believe he is working on a third one. But this one has quite a few things going for it in a wider sense. But The Call, the premise of it, it's a little dystopian. It's a little urban fantasy. It's a little bit everything. The idea is that modern-day Ireland, or sort of alternate modern-day Ireland, has been completely cut off from the rest of the modern world by the fairy folk. And whenever a human hits a certain age as a teenager, they disappear from the human world for what appears to the human world to only be a couple minutes, what is actually 24 hours in the other world. And when they return, they are either dead most of the time, or if they survive, sometimes they have been like monstrously changed. Other times they have not been monstrously changed, but the experience itself is extremely traumatic and affects them. And the reason that I recommend it, the reason that I like it, is because it really does sort of adhere to the more traditional folkloric view of the fairies as beings that are very foreign to humanity, that have their own agency, but can seem very capricious and cruel to humans. And it's very well done. As with pretty much any sort of fiction, obviously liberties are taken for plot points, so that has to be kept in mind. But overall, very good, very close to folklore. So definitely something that I would recommend if folkloric fairies interest you. Sorry. So another one, it's called War for the Oaks. This is an older one. I believe this came out in the 80s. Not 100% sure offhand, but it is an older work. It's very good, though. It sort of plays off of the idea which is embedded throughout Celtic language-speaking folklore, that the fairy folk need a human surrogate to be involved if they are conducting warfare or games. They need one human on their side in order to successfully engage in these activities with each other, particularly if there's going to be an actual consequence involved. So the premise, the plot of it is these two groups of fairies are going to war, and they need a human. This one side needs a human in order to effectively do this. And the main character, unfortunately for her, is the human who gets sort of dragged into it. And again, I like it because it pretty much adheres to the older folklore view of fairies. It has a lot of folklore in it. And it also has a good diversity of the fairies that appear in the story. So that's sort of more interesting. The next one, this is something I've actually reviewed on my blog as well. It's a book called The Knowing. I believe this is currently out of print, so I'm not sure how difficult it is to find. If you can find it, though, I do highly recommend it. It's sort of loosely based around the stories about Reverend Robert Kirk. He was a minister in Scotland who wrote a non-fiction book about the fair folk in 1691, I believe it was. It wasn't published until more than a century after his death. But there's a lot of folklore surrounding his life. Many people believe that he did not actually die, that he was kidnapped or taken by the fairies, that there was a chance for him to be rescued that failed, and that he still resides among the fair folk today, which is part of one of the subplots going on in the book. The main plot of the book is that has to do with the way that a fairy curse can linger through a family line, and sort of consequences of that, if you will. Humans dealing with that as it echoes through time. But again, very accurate to the folklore relating to fairies. It's another one that sort of portrays them as capricious, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, but very foreign to humans. It doesn't overly anthropomorphize them, which I really appreciate because that's a real struggle in a lot of other books. So that was a nice touch. Again, it is currently out of print as far as I know. I'm not sure how hard it is to find. If you can find it though, I highly recommend it. So, next book, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. This one is definitely still in print. Again, really good, true to the traditional folklore depiction of fairies. The bulk of the story is sort of about these two magicians in England, not in the modern era, but in a historic period, and sort of the broad idea of real magic in England being revived or not, as the case may be. But one of the magicians makes a deal with one of the fair folk in order for one of his spells to succeed. I don't want to give away too many spoilers here. And then there's quite a lot of consequences that come from that deal and from him sort of drawing the interest of this particular Lord of the Otherworld, if you will. And it is a particularly good book from a folklore perspective. So highly recommend. And then the final book, which I'll touch on quickly, is Lords and Ladies. This one is the only one out of all of these that is a high fantasy. It does not take place in this world, sort of an alternate world. But it's one where the fairies, the elves, have been sort of driven out. And something happens that gets their attention and pulls them back and allows them to come back into this world. And very, very unpleasant consequences ensue. So I always recommend it just to give people an understanding of sort of the glory and the majesty that can come with the other crowd and the risk and the danger. And I can pull out like 20 excellent quotes from Lords and Ladies. It's probably the book that I quote the most often because there's a lot of just really, really good material in there. And again, very accurate to the wider folklore that we find. And that's not to say that I wouldn't recommend the other books behind me. And there actually are a few others that I could pull out and kind of add to this pile. I was just trying to keep it a little smaller, focusing on these 5. But generally speaking, you do want to be cautious with any book that's really over anthropomorphizing the fair folk in the book. If they're basically acting like humans, if they seem to be motivated by the same sorts of things that humans would be motivated by, if you could basically treat that same character as if they were a human character and it wouldn't significantly change anything, then that's not really staying true to the folklore. Just, part of what makes fairies is that they aren't human. And they don't tend to act like humans. Their motivations aren't human. They tend to often baffle humans in the way they do react to things, in what they want for things, and just general how they act. So anytime we have books where really the fairy characters are being written much more as if they were just human characters with a more interesting backstory, that's always going to be sort of a red flag that it's not staying very true to folklore as a rule. So on top of the books, I did want to quickly touch on some movies that I would recommend. I love multimedia, books, TV shows, movies. You can find fairies everywhere. I had pointed out Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell as a novel. That is also a TV series. You can find it on Amazon Prime. It only got 1 season. My sad face here. But that is an excellent, excellent one to watch, to kind of get a feel for fairies and folklore and how they can be depicted well on TV or movie. I guess it's kind of like a mini series. It's like eight episodes. Otherwise, outright movies. Pan's Labyrinth is a really good one. The Secret of Roan Inish. It's an older one now. It came out in the 90s. Deals mostly with Selkie lore. And I like that one especially because the main story arc is sort of based around Selkie lore, but it also has quite a few of these little sort of sub-stories that get told or go on throughout the main plot that are also focused around Selkie lore. And they're all very, very true and accurate to the folklore that we find, both historically and still today. There's another one, it's a cartoon, it's called The Song of the Sea. I do recommend that one. It does have some good folklore in it, but it does vary a little more from the folklore than most of the others. So I sort of recommend that one with a grain of salt, as it were. It's good, but for example, like there's nothing in folklore that says that Selkies can't talk, or, you know, have any reason to be mute, things like that. So just putting that out there. Again, sort of going back, the 1980s, the movie Labyrinth, a little more intended for children, sort of. But it does kind of keep to the idea of fairies being mercurial and both kind and cruel, and sort of having their own motivations and agency and unpredictability to them. The goblins are pretty goofy. Actual goblins would be a lot more malicious than the ones in that movie, but generally speaking, the wider notes that it hits are pretty accurate to folklore, so I'm willing to recommend that one. There's also a movie called The Hollow. I believe it's from 2016 or 2017. It's Irish. It's a horror movie, more specifically, and there are some details to it that are not really strict to folklore, particularly how the fairies sort of convert other people, I guess we'll say, to avoid spoilers. But generally speaking, a lot of the folklore in the movie and a lot of the notes the movie hits, a lot of the themes in the plot are very true to folklore and very good. It's very accurate in a wider sense. So I definitely recommend that one. Outside of that, I haven't actually watched The Magicians, but I've heard that, I think it's the 2nd season that has the fairies in it, that the fairies in that show are reasonably accurate. I haven't watched it myself yet. I haven't had time, so I can't say for sure. There's a couple others that I could probably throw in here, but again, I don't want to get too long with this. The same rule basically applies to fairies in movies and TV as I had just talked about with the books. If they're acting too human, if they seem too motivated by things that we would expect humans to be motivated by, if you could basically just assume that character is human and nothing would radically change with them, then they're not really being treated like a folkloric fairy. They're basically a human in costume, if you will. There's nothing wrong with that. It can still be super entertaining. I do get people sometimes ask me about Carnival Row, because that's the sort of newest show that came out. Those are not folkloric fairies in any sense. It's an entertaining show. I didn't hate it. I did give it a review, and there's a lot of problems that I saw with it, but I won't get into that. You can find it on my blog if you're really curious about my wider opinions. But for the purposes of this video, the point is that the fairies that are shown in Carnival Row are not folkloric fairies. First of all, they don't really seem to have any magic, which is kind of one of the hallmarks of what fairies are and do, both in folklore and anecdotal accounts and all the material we have about them. So to see fairies without magic right from the off is a little weird. Outside of that, it's sort of got a mashup of different types of beings from mythology and folklore. No sort of rhyme or reason to that. And of course, fairies really don't have wings. Up until the really modern era, like the last 50 or 60 years or so, have we seen anecdotal accounts of people seeing fairies with wings, and then they're always the super tiny ones. So the idea of human-sized fairies with wings, that's a little odd. But all of that aside, my point just being that, it may be a good and entertaining show, but the fairies as they're depicted in it are vastly different from what we see in folklore. And again, they're all cases where you could basically have those exact same characters be human, and it would make no difference. They would still pretty much act the same way, they would make the same choices and decisions, they would do the same things, and it wouldn't change anything. And that being the case, it's usually a good way to measure that they're not being true or acting true to folkloric descriptions or depictions of fairies. So, that all said, I hope that answers the question of what I would recommend, or some of my recommendations for good folkloric depictions of fairies in books and movies and a TV show. Again, I could probably list a few more, but I just wanted to highlight some for these purposes. If you have any other questions, or if you have any specific thing that you have read or seen that you're curious about my opinion of, feel free to ask. Like I said, there's a lot more I probably could get into here. I'm just sort of highlighting a few. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and I will try to make another video again at some point soon.